All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're in talk number, I don't know what, of our two-day anniversary marathon. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with Doris Salcedo and Bouchra Khalili, two really amazing artists who've come a long way to join us. Maybe a little bit less for Bouchra. Excuse me. But I'm really excited about this conversation and being able to be up here with both of you. Bouchra's history with the New Museum goes back to an exhibition we did in 2014 that was called Here and Elsewhere. And if you saw that exhibition, you would remember her piece. It was on the 4th floor of the museum, and it was an 8-channel video installation where what you saw most of on the screen was an image of a map and people tracing different journeys on the map. And this is a project she did called the Mapping Journeys Project. And it's been exhibited throughout the world at this point, I think, but is, I think, emblematic of the kind of research and thought that goes into your work. And it was really, I think, one of the touchstones of that exhibition. And Doris Salcedo had an amazing exhibition here from 1998. And I think that was your first solo show in the United States. And it went on to travel to Site Santa Fe and SF MoMA. So I think there's a lot of things that we can touch on in our discussion. You know, both of you have dedicated a lot of your work to looking at aspects of exploitation and abuse of power, and people and subjects whose histories have been somehow marginalized. And I think you're also both interested in this question of how to produce an image of something that's somehow on the edge of what is visible, and how to recount human experiences without simply repeating them. I think of Pasolini with your work, Bouchra, and there's this phrase that's been used with Pasolini, which is a civic poet. And I think of both of you as civic poets in a sense. So yeah, with that, I don't know, I think maybe we can kind of jump into a question about research and storytelling. Bouchra, you had a show in 2008 in Marseille that was called Storytellers. And as probably many of you know, storytelling and oral traditions are have a strong history in Morocco, which is where you were born and raised. I wonder if you could just open by telling us a bit about your relationship to storytelling, maybe how it influenced you as you were growing up, how you first gravitated to it as a form to make work with, and yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here, and thank you for this invitation. I feel extremely honored to contribute to this anniversary, and mostly with you, Doris, because I admire your work a lot. So it's very moving for me to be sitting next to you and to be having this conversation. Well, to answer your question, I have to approach it from two different perspectives, but that are actually connected in a way. It is true that the most ancient form of performing art in Morocco is basically storytelling, and it's called al-halqa. It's a word in Arabic that not refers to the performance, but that refers to the audience. It refers to the circle that the audience form around the storyteller. And the stories are usually being told in a public space, on a square, a plaza, an open-air market, and it's actually a form of performance that I used to attend when I was a kid and that I enjoyed a lot, because even though they were based on storytelling, they had also sort of complex structure with many interludes made of songs, reciting poems, telling jokes, interacting with the audience, and some viewers engaging in a sort of dialogue, and digression was somehow part of the whole performance. So it required a sort of training, because you have to memorize literally thousands of stories, but at the same time you have to also improvise and react with the audience. The other perspective is that, in a way, storytelling is a sort of alternative history book in Morocco. and I guess in most of North Africa, because somehow the question of history was both appropriated first by the colonial power, but also by the regime that were established after the independence, that somehow hijacked the history of the country, and we were, in a way, prevented to tell the story of the people themselves. So that alternative history was actually told into the forms of stories within the private space, among family, and that's basically how I learned the history of Morocco, and the one that was not included in the history book because it was not what was meant to be the official narrative before the independence or after the independence, or about the struggle for independence. It's something that we were told, and that we were told to repeat only in private areas among us. So it was the history of the people told by the people to the people, but that was not written in a way. So I guess I was, in a way, very influenced both by this practice of civic poetry. You were mentioning Pasolini, who is indeed one of my major influence, and in that figure of the storyteller, of the public storyteller, there is also that alternative history of Morocco that was told in a very metaphorical way, very hidden, extremely subtle. But as members of the audience, of course, we understood what he was talking about. So there was also this culture of language and the power of speech that was operating at different level. One that was very literal, and the other that was more hidden and more metaphorical. So maybe it is something that one can identify in my works in video, where speech play a very important role.
I mean, I'm curious too, because storytelling can be, as you're saying, this kind of alternative history and a way for people to maintain a narrative that's otherwise, somehow going to be wiped out by a maybe more powerful colonial narrative in this case. But storytelling also has a relationship to fiction. And, I'm curious to hear you consider or speak to a little bit of how you think about fiction in relationship to your work, and this tension between fiction and documentary.
Documentary is a very tricky word. So as much as political art as well. But I'm not sure if fiction can be easily defined as well, because from the moment one talk or tells something, it is not told in the air. It is received by someone else, and therefore the reception or the people or the individual who is hearing that stories become also part of the story itself. So maybe if there's a relationship to fiction, it is in this interval between what is being said and how it is pictured by the viewer or by an audience or by a listener. So the fiction does not necessarily depend on the stories that is being told. It also depends by the individual who is listening to the story. It's a sort of open platform that can be filled by many different other things and factors. So it's one of the reasons why I don't personally consider that I work with documentary. I would rather say that I work with what can seem to be documentary strategies, but it's not about documenting something. It's more about showing something to someone. So it can maybe define in terms of gesture. And that's also what always fascinated me with moving image and film history, because it actually starts with this. It's at the end of the day, it's always about showing something to someone. I'm showing you this. How do you react to it? How do you engage with it? But the image is never completed. It's never a final image. It is as much as well a sort of space where a proposition is made and is received, but it's not completed. It requires to be met and to be somehow filled with other perspective, other views, which is in a way the opposite of what is mostly considered today as documentary. I'm speaking of that because I took a membership on Netflix, and there are like hundreds of documentaries that are proposed that all look similar in the way they are made. And it's interesting that now documentary is that extremely formatted way of documenting something, but that is even more formatted than fiction itself, you know. So I'm wondering until what point we can still talk of documentary.
There's a number of your works, and the Mapping Journeys project is not one of them, but a lot of your recent works, I'm thinking of the Tempest Society, which you debuted in Documenta, and Foreign Office. These are video works that kind of are narrated over chapters, and they involve these kind of contemporary characters or figures or non-actors who are looking back at a particular history, and it's often a history from the 1970s that has some kind of like radical or revolutionary tenor to it. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Tempest Society. I think there was a nice phrase you used describing that. You said it's neither documentary or fiction, but it's a hypothesis. And I think I know what you mean by that, but I wonder if you could describe a little bit what that work, what it is, what your research was like for that, and why you think of it as something like a hypothesis.
I think it was just about making clear that I don't work with documentary or fiction, because in a way I think all of my works can be defined as hypotheses, because they all start with what about if? And this could also definitely define as well the Mapping Journey project, because it could be also described as what if we were showing on a map? What if the map was turned into both a page on which a journey could be described and drawn and pictured? So that description of the Tempest Society was just about clarifying it. I thought it was the right time to do it.
Could you say a little bit about the theater group that you were looking at in that, and what attracted you to that project and that history surrounding that?
Well, most of my works originate in stories and ideas I had many years before. And at some point I have the opportunity to produce those works. But I started working on the Tempest Society from 2011 or 12, and I had already in mind to produce it in Athens. So the invitation extended by Documenta was a sort of extraordinary coincidence, because it was happening there as well. But the story of the theater group called Al-Asifa is a story that was told to me by my father, because he knew about the group of activists who later turned themselves into street performers and a theater group. But at the same time, it's also part of those series of works I started developing around 2011, 2012, about the history of collective emancipation in North Africa and the Middle East. Because there were also stories I have always known that were told to me at home, and that I always thought I would work on that one day. Like for Any Office, I always thought that I would produce something like this one day, even before thinking that I would become an artist. So I spent a lot of time and few years collecting a lot of material and building up a sort of body of documentation and research on which I can rely in a way. And it's also, to be honest, a way for me to not feeling anxious, because when you collect a lot of things, you don't have to worry about what you will do with that. You know, like ideas can mature in a very quiet and peaceful way. It makes you very like relaxed and calm, and then when you feel ready to produce it, you just do it. The other thing is that at the moment of what was defined as the Arab Spring, because in reality the first work that was directly connected to Foreign Affairs and the Tempest Society is Garden Conversation, that is also based on the history of emancipation in North Africa, but that one goes back to the to the 1950s, but to the history of Morocco in the 1920s and the resistance against the colonization. I thought that at this moment, maybe we should look back to our history, because the way the Arab revolutions were pictured in the media were very much about the Facebook revolutions, and as if the Arabs needed Facebook like to start a revolution. Now we have Facebook, we can do it. But the history of the Middle East and North Africa is basically a revolutionary history for the last 200 years. And that's also the narrative that is missing when one thinks of the uprising in the area. So in a way, it's also, one can look at it as if the history of decolonization was not over yet, that it is also a new age. And when I'm saying that, I'm not only referring to the colonization from the West. It's also about the authoritarian regimes and the dictatorships that were implemented after the independence. So it's also the reason why I thought, okay, now we should go back to history. It's paradoxically the right time for that.
Doris, I want to jump to you. Your work has so much to do with violent regimes as well. But I think what people sometimes forget about is that each one of your works has a particular story behind it. And I know that research is extremely important for you. So I wondered if you could speak a bit about your research process and how it is that you go about, how you first encounter a story, how you kind of dig deeper or investigate a little bit more. And what's your process like when you're first kind of developing a work through a story that you've encountered?
I don't think only in terms of authoritarian regimes. I think more in terms of political violence that is taking place all over the world. I terribly dislike the idea that maybe because Bouchra and I, we come from, she comes from Morocco, I come from Colombia, have conflicted histories, that our work is located exclusively in those areas. I think, of course, my work began in Colombia, which is a country that has endured civil war for 200 years, and it has been labeled in negative terms. So that negative history can give me a perspective. But then my work does not come from Colombia, it comes from turmoil. And turmoil, it's all over the place, and we're living turmoil right here in this country right now, and all over the world. So I think it's good, I always appreciate, and I think you will do the same thing if you are let out of the ghetto. It's not just this little country, it's not just oppressive regimes. It is a view on contemporary political violence that is taking place everywhere. Saying that, then I start working always with the testimony of a victim of political violence. It could be Colombian, it could be from any place in the world where tragic events take place. And those tragic, terrible events take place everywhere, every day. I research deeply for years. I interview people, and these interviews are really the essence, prerequisite for the very existence of my work. So once I have these testimonies, I try to erase myself, and I try to be faithful to whatever has been given to me, either an object or a story or a word or whatever. And from there, I start building the work.
And when you're encountering a story, might it just happen at any moment? Like you open the newspaper and you read something, and then you bookmark it, and you sort of dig deeper a bit later, or how does it work? Is it?
No. I I research different events that I consider that are very important, that are events that are giving shape to our daily life. So for example, migration is one of the issues that I have worked for many, many years. And it's not that I happen to open a newspaper, it's that I think it's a defining aspect of our life. So we have now 1 billion migrants in the world, 250 million external international migrants, and 750 million internal displaced people, displaced by force. So it are these kind of events that are shaping the world, that are really instituting, for example, the migrant as the most important political figure of our time. I focus on those big issues. And then I research those issues for years and years and years and years. And I think that it is the research, it is the devotion towards what happened to somebody else that is the essence of every one of the pieces I make. So it's never the autobiographical, it's never the local. I think I want to be engaged with tragic events. Of course, seen from my perspective. I come from a place and I'm a woman, and of course, it is from my perspective. But then I want to open that up.
Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about what the research looks like? I know that you've looked a lot at gun violence in the United States, for example. What kind of, what did you do to kind of look further into that subject, and who are the kinds of people that you spoke with? And yeah, I'm just curious to hear a little bit more of what kind of shape your research takes, because we don't actually see that in your exhibitions and your work, but we know that it's a big component of what you do.
Well, it changes. When I was researching gun violence in the States, I would visit certain neighborhoods in Chicago, in LA, and talk to the people. I go to jails and talk to people who are in jail. I talk to gang members. I visit centers. I do move around. In the case of migrants, for example, for the piece that is currently in view in Madrid, I was visiting cemeteries where migrants have been buried in Italy, in Greece. So it is a really in-depth research where I travel all over the world, where I go and talk to the people, or I visit areas. I need to see what is happening. I need to know what is happening before I try to make it into a piece. But once I start working, then all these events that are highly charged, that are highly emotional, they become strangely neutral in the work. Then it changes once I'm working. I need to create a certain distance. So I'm not exactly using or touching the person, but I'm behind. I'm not there describing. I think I like Jorge Luis Borges' definition of what it is, of what art is, and he says that is the imminent revelation of something that never takes place, a revelation that never takes place. But you feel this imminence, so it's almost there. So on one hand, I research and I go to places and I visit, but on the other hand, then I put myself behind that.
You've used this phrase "social death" in a few texts of yours, and I understand it as a way of describing what a group of people that has been marginalized. Am I understanding it right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think this is for me, that's a very important concept, and it's something I learned while I was researching gun violence in the States. At some point, at the beginning of my career, I was working basically with victims that are only victims. I was thinking of, let's say, like Anna Frank. It's just a pure victim. And then I realized, visiting Southeast LA neighborhoods, for example, I realized there is a gray zone where the victim can become a perpetrator and backwards, where the social conditions are so raw and difficult that you can inhabit this gray zone where you can be both victim and perpetrator at the same time. So in these areas is where I found that social death. And that social death always is present before an actual physical violent death takes place.
It's kind of also a invisibility, or do you mean it's also when people become sort of socially invisible or politically invisible?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. If you are stateless, paperless, if you are outside of the system, if you are left behind in terms of race or class or whatever, then you inhabit that area, and then you are more vulnerable. And there is no coincidence that more blacks and browns are being killed all over the world, not only here. It's because we inhabit that area. And that's what is so unfair, and that's why it is political violence, even though it might be just what you call gun violence. I don't think it is gun violence. I think it's political violence, and it is something that is controlled from higher up.
I have a question too about visibility in your works. Bouchra, one thing that was really interesting for me with the Mapping Journeys project is how the narrators in each of these videos, you can see their hands as they're tracing their journey on the map, but you never see their faces. What you do hear is their voices and their narrative, but you don't see any face. And Doris, in your work, there's often, I think nearly always, an absence of pictorial imagery, and you're also very careful to keep out any details or explicit narrative of the stories that you're paying witness to or in the work. So I guess I'm interested in how you work out this tension between what is visible and what's not visible. And does it matter to you that not everything is exposed to the viewer at once?
I think it's very important that it's not absolutely visible. I think the most important art, for me at least, is the art that does not show everything. Because I'm working only on political violence means that you imprint by force this image on the person the violent one is attacking. So violence is imprinted by force. It's an image. Violence makes an image of itself. So it is very important for me to address violence without ever describing or repeating or reenacting the violent act itself. So it should be like an epiphany in absence. So it happens, it can be in fear, understood. It can be glimpsed, but not exactly presented, because I think violent death, it's outside the realm of representation. It cannot become symbolic because it is pornographic. So for that reason, it is essential that it is not present.
Bouchra, what about
well,
for you?
I absolutely agree. I think that when Edouard Glissant addressed the question of the right to opacity, that's also what he means. I personally, all those images of migrants and refugees who are landing, being rescued, or surrounded by hundreds of cameras, this is also violence, and it is an extreme violence against their right to opacity. Why should they be pictured? Why should they be offered to the curiosity of an audience? What kind of curiosity is that? Speaking of violence, this is a form of violence too.
Absolutely.
And working, and at the same time, And I agree with you. I think our practice cannot be restricted to the fact that you come from Colombia, I come from Morocco.
Very important.
Nevertheless, my first perception of the question of individuals who are forced to travel illegally comes from my experience as being someone who grew up in Casablanca. Because these are stories that were being told in the everyday life. That man crossed last night. And you would hear that every single day. And at the same time, it was not in the public debate. It was completely silenced by the media and by the power, precisely because they were very much aware that if people were risking their lives crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, it was not only because of the poverty, it was also a form of opposition and resistance towards the regime. And 10 years after, there were all those cameras waiting for them around Tarifa, Caña de la Meca, all those places in southern Spain, where the most lucky ones eventually arrive. And what was shown were those cameras, you know, and this picture of the migrant as shaped by the media and therefore by the power. So the question was not only about how do you preserve a right to opacity, but how do you also try to not make an image, because an image is, at the end of the day, always a fragment that carries its own ambiguity. It cannot tell a whole story. It cannot tell, a whole story. There is always a sort of what the French call a manque à voir, something that is missing to see, but it's precisely the site where there is a chance for, let's say, a space for an equal and interaction with an image. So growing up and accepting the idea that I would become an artist, the question of the image as a fragment, the not showing that is paradoxically the real side of the image became prominent in my way of approaching image making. It is part of it. And it is somehow the side around which you try to develop that side where something can be seen at the same time. It will never be shown completely. But paradoxically, that's also the chance you are offering, or the opportunity you are offering to a viewer to picture what is missing. The image won't be completed at the end of the day, but at least it will be understood that there is something a bit precarious in that relationship, but at the same time that allows, again, a sort of equal interaction, and maybe also a space for a sort of ethic of image making, until what point you accept to distance yourself, and accepting the idea that you won't show it, because you can't. And I don't believe that you can show the whole experience of someone who survived such violence. Speaking of individuals forced to travel illegally, or individuals who were jailed, or relatives of people who were killed, there is a limit to that, and it should be included in the image, that there is a limit, and one shouldn't expect that more should be shown.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was thinking too about the partiality of stories as well. You know, that any story, any account is going to be not just partial in the sense of biased, but just incomplete. It's, you know, you're not going to ever have the full story. And, you know, I was thinking on the one hand, how do you deal with that when you're absorbing these narratives? But I'm also thinking now that that's somehow essential to producing the kind of work that you're making, that having a partial story is the only way to have it.
Yeah, I think it's very important to know that we're always telling a fragmentary story. And we're telling that fragmentary story for many reasons. One is that I think your work and my work, we're not working based on identities. It's a post-identitarian perspective. So you are approaching people from different parts of the world, and I try to do the same thing. And so we don't work from a proper place. We work from a place of insufficiency, where this fragmentary, incomplete history is told and retold, and we permanently are making attempts. So it is fragmentary, because that's the nature, and it is a political position from which I dare to say we both work. And that is essential. You cannot attempt nowadays to tell a complete, a total or totalitarian history. That such a thing is not. I don't think it's possible.
I had another thought too about that relates to identity, but not the identity of, in terms of where you come from, or that you're both women, but how you identify with the work that you make. So, and when an artist makes something, we typically think that there's something of the artist that ends up in the work. And, that's the product of them having been involved in the creation of it. And I think maybe paradoxically for both of you, so much of your work is about resisting that entire idea. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, each of you. How have you somehow adopted strategies to keep yourself out of the work? Or, is that in some sense the definition of a successful work for you, that you've, managed to really sort of remove your own voice as much as possible?
Well, I think for me it's very important that the work is not autobiographical, that is removed from the autobiographical, and that it is intimately linked to a political immediacy. I think it's very important to be in a specific place and having a perspective, and from there you sort of hang on to a traumatic event. And that's how I think my work has developed. I'm not interested at all in personal aspects. I'm always working based on the experience of other people. Nonetheless, I cannot deny that it is through this body, through myself, that the experiences are being dealt with and elaborated and actualized. There's no denying that. So it is a bit ambiguous. I wish it were not, but completely, I wish it were not autobiographical, but I think it is in a way. It is impossible that it is completely detached from myself. So that tension, it's always present in my work. I don't know you.
Well, as you, I don't consider that my biography has any impact on my work, and at the same time, one of my sisters and my parents visited my last solo exhibition in Paris, and they told me something which I found beautiful. They told me, "You are telling our stories." And I think what they meant is not our family story. I think they meant you are telling the stories of the people like us. So it's not biographical, but the way they perceived it is that it could speak to many different people and who could approach those works as a part of their stories. But again, it won't tell the whole story. I actually forgot the last part of your question. No, now I remember it. At the same time, I must say obsessed with some writings by Pasolini, like essays that he wrote from the mid-60s until the early 70s about the semiotics of filmmaking. What is that strange language that is called cinema? And he developed a series of ideas which I always found fascinating, and on which I've been meditating literally for 20 years, even before becoming an artist. What a free indirect speech means within the context of filmmaking. What is that very strange position of a filmmaker or an image maker that is capturing the words of other people, and at the same time, the words of that filmmakers are somewhere there. But where are they exactly? When and where do they merge together? And to me, it became a sort of beautiful description of the position of an image maker or an artist or a filmmaker. It is not our speech. It is not our words. The words belongs to the ones who are delivering them, but at the same time we are somewhere there. I'm not sure if it answers your question, but it's really an idea I've been thinking of really for a long, long time now. Yeah.
I think it's wonderful to think that it doesn't matter who's speaking, that it could be anonymous or plural, and it would be wonderful if we could focus on whatever is being addressed in the work, knowing who's speaking.
Yeah, and you were starting this conversation with quoting the figure of the civic poet as redefined by Pasolini, because it's a very old tradition in Italy, but the contribution of Pasolini was somehow bringing back the figure of the civic poet to the side of the anti-patriotic conception of the elegy of the tradition of the country. Let's say turning it into something more, less official, less connected to the image or the images of the power. So it's not by chance that he also worked so extensively on this question of the free and direct speech, because as you said, the free and direct speech is this site where a plurality of voices can be heard and can be delivered. So what I also find fascinating in this process, and what I also try to do with my works in video, is to also capture that moment when the subjective voice tend to become a collective one, tend not to necessarily embody multiple voices, but it becomes a collective voice. It starts speaking for the ones who are the absentees or the speechless in that moment, and that also potentially address a sort of new collective to come into being. It's not existing yet, but potentially in an art space they can start gathering together there and meeting in potentialities in a way. Yeah.
Well, I think that also speaks to your work, Doris, and the universality of it. That's not just a collectivity of voices, but you're telling stories that have a universal impact.
I think they could have a universal impact as long as they are not, as they don't become framed within the third world, which is something that happens a lot when people write about my work. They always say, oh, it's something that is happening in her native Colombia. And then that kills the possibility of this work becoming truly a collective enunciation, becoming truly plural, and becoming universal, because we are all human beings. And as long as we don't recognize that we are all equal, there are things that exceed our identity that can unite us and we can recognize as purely human, then it's very difficult. I think what I attempt to do, or what art tends to do, is to redefine what is human. And that should be enlarged every day. Every work of art try to enlarge, to encapsulate some parts of humanity that have been left out of the official history. So it is important for me that it becomes truly collective, and that it can go to different places. I have spent years researching Ceuta and Melilla, for example. And that doesn't mean that I have to only talk about Colombia or only this, but it can cross borders. It can go beyond. I always liked Martin Luther King quote when he said that he's been working segregation all his life, so he was not going to segregate his moral concerns. So I think we can pay attention to what is happening everywhere. It doesn't have to be restricted, but and that's my intention, but sometimes that's not the way the work is perceived.
Well, thank you both so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.